Peace. Achille Damone Height here. Today I wanted to talk about something that's near and dear to me. The Generation X, forgotten generation, as they call us. So I am a proud Generation Xer. And the reason that I'm talking about this today is because lately I've been actually searching for various videos where they talk about the fact that we are the forgotten generation. So Generation X, the name itself, X means the unknown. And the name has become a self-fulfilling prophecy. I believe that some of the younger generations, maybe the millennials, definitely the Gen Zers, are lumping the Generation Xers into the same generation as the baby boomers, which are our parents, and they're calling us all boomers. So I'm here to tell you that no, we are our own distinct generation. We are the generation that actually grew hip hop up to a worldwide phenomenon. One of many things, but that's just to put it in terms where, maybe pop culture terms. We didn't create hip hop, but we grew it up. We actually grew up with hip hop. So we grew it up into for better or for worse, the commercial form that it's known as today. So I wanted to also talk about just my story. Me being a proud Generation Xer, I was born during the time where information was in analog form. So most of my life, actually, my young life, my childhood was an analog childhood. But unlike most people, I had the advantage of having a mother who worked for a company that was on the leading edge of technology. That company was Xerox. So in case you didn't know, Xerox is responsible for how we actually view computing today. Obviously, there was IBM, but Xerox, for the most part, they were known as a copier machine company, which is what the name became synonymous of. Xeroxing meant to photocopy something. But Xerox also invented, because they had the Palo Alto Research Center, which was called PARC, which is in Palo Alto, California, which is now Silicon Valley. They invented, I don't think they actually invented the mouse, but they actually developed the mouse to become functional and to become how we use it today. They invented the laser printer. They invented the graphical user interface, the GUI. So prior to Xerox, everything was command line. So black and white screen or black and green screen, just letters, text based. They used that mouse to point and click so that personal computers can become more user friendly. They also invented the first personal computer. I believe it was called the Alto. In the mid 1970s. I didn't do my research on this topic prior, so I believe if my memory serves me correctly, it was 1973. They invented the fonts. So they sold those fonts to Adobe, but those fonts like Times New Roman, Arial, all the sans serifs, my mother actually worked in the fonts department when I was younger. So I had the um, pleasure and the advantage, the competitive advantage to have grown up with technology. We had my first computer, which it wasn't really a computer by today's standards because it was very limited in functionality. But the very first computer that we had in our home was in the year 1981. And that was, back then, my mother got a discount. It was a Xerox computer. I forget the exact name, the model of it, but it was a big old heavy CRT monitor, a drive, meaning they had drive A and drive B. Drive A, which it took a 8-inch floppy. Those floppies, it was a floppy drive. So those floppies had a storage capacity of 1.44 megabytes. And just to put it in context, that could store approximately 144 pages of plain text. Or if we're talking about music, maybe a minute and a half of music. But we weren't storing music back then. It was just all plain text. So drive A was the operating system. It didn't have a built-in hard drive. It was drive A was the operating system. So you had to boot into drive A, and drive B was whatever application you wanted to run. So usually that was a word processing application, maybe a spreadsheet app. Maybe we would have games. It wasn't graphical video games, but text-based games. And then a large printer. It was a dot matrix printer. That whole setup, which took up a lot of space on your desk, in your home, in your office, wherever you put it. With my mother's discount, she still paid approximately $5,000. And that was 1981 dollars. I'm not sure what that is equivalent of today, but something tells me it was probably $20,000. So we had this computer in our home for about almost 10 years, as computers developed. But I thought it was just so fascinating that, wow, I don't need a typewriter anymore. I can just type on this digital machine, and then if I made a mistake, I can backspace and replace it without having to use whiteout after I printed it out. So that was revolutionary for the time. So over the years, that 1.44 megabytes of storage is obviously not sufficient as applications grew, the size of these applications, as the need to store data grew. So the storage space started increasing, and then the use cases for the storage capacity, that increased as well, or that multiplied. And so I watched, as a Generation Xer, growing up in this analog world, I watched as the world became more digitized. So like Erykah Badu said in a song, she said, "Analog girl in a digital world." Shout out to Erykah Badu, a fellow Generation Xer, born in 1971 like myself. By the way, a side note, 1971 was the year that the floppy drive was invented by IBM. So I've talked about the significance of 1971 before, but I was born on the same exact day that the Pentagon Papers dropped. If you don't know what the Pentagon Papers are, there was a movie made called The Post with Meryl Streep and Tom Hanks. I believe somebody won an Academy Award for it, but it was based on a true story. So June 13th, which was a Sunday, 1971, look that up. That was actually significant because that was information that the rest of the world was not privy to. That was kind of like the WikiLeaks of that day, right? The Post, they leaked information from the Pentagon that was basically top secret, and they could have went to prison for it. So I'm just mentioning that because I touched on that on a video before. I was born at the very first day of the information age. That's the way I look at it, which is why it makes sense that I went into information technology. So going, excuse me, fast forwarding to coming through the 80s and the 90s, as the world was transitioning from analog to digital. And what is the difference between analog and digital? Well, just high level explanation. Analog is a continuous flow, where digital are packets of information. They are distinct, discrete packages of information. So we call it pixels, like when you talk about video graphics, they're pixelization as opposed to waves. It's binary, zeros and ones. So there are pros and cons to each, analog as well as digital. But one prime example of analog versus digital is the analog clock. You'll see that second hand moving in a continuous flow of information, where the digital clock is moving 1, 2, 3. So there are discrete, not flows, but discrete packages of information that are flashing right in front of you. So that's the generic or the high level difference between analog and digital. I believe the Gen Zers and possibly the generation after that, but whatever they're called, what are they called? Gen Alphas. They are bringing back analog technology when it comes to music, because music, it turns out that it has a higher quality in analog. So those record players, those records, 33 RPM, 45 RPM. I don't know if they're bringing back the 45 RPMs, but definitely the 33s, the large records, they have a better quality sound. You can even argue that analog is just a better quality of living. But as we moved into the 1990s, where the personal computing revolution took hold, and there was a personal computer, not necessarily in every house, but in every business. Usually on every desk of an information worker, there was a personal computer. And it possibly was not connected to the internet, because the internet was commercialized in 1994. But they actually, prior to the internet being commercialized, I mean, they did have America Online and CompuServe and Prodigy prior to 1994, but they were like member-based. They were very small networks. And the majority of the people weren't using those networks. Speaking of Xerox, they also invented what's called the Ethernet, which is the cabling system used in networking to transmit data. But Xerox also had, we call it the intranet now, which was an internal network. They used to call it the Ethernet. And my mother used to print information from the Ethernet and bring it home to me. And this was back in the 1980s. She would print it from the bulletin board. And let's just say We call them employee resource groups now, but back then, the black employees at Xerox, they had a group and they had a bulletin board and they would post information about black history. And my mother would print it and she would bring it home to me. And I would learn more information about black history that they weren't teaching us in school. So that's a side note. But as we move more into this digital world, that process is called datafication. And what datafication is, it's making everything that we do, it's making it a form of data. So for example, exercising. Now we can measure our heart rates and we can wear wearable technology. I'm wearing this Apple Watch right now. That is an example of datafication. So everything is becoming data and it's being uploaded to storage devices and essentially the cloud. So with this datafication, that introduces risks to the equation. What's the biggest risk is that anything that's data needs to be secured because it can be hacked. So what we're experiencing now is a influx of hacking, which means that data needs to be secure more than ever, which is why the rise of cybersecurity has become a viable career path. So those of you who were born in the 21st century, you may have had, unless you've done your own research, unless you've been taught this, you may have no idea what life was like before the internet, what life was like before computers. So that's why I'm here to explain it to you, because I've lived through both worlds and I have a great perspective on not just life before and afterwards, but the impact and how life has been differentiated since not just the computer, but since the internet, and not just since the internet, but since social media. And as we move forward, there are several technologies that are disrupting humanity as we know today. And it's all driven by data, or what the industry calls big data. Obviously, it's AI or machine learning. Then there's virtual reality or augmented reality. There's also the blockchain, which has pros and cons, but the one benefit of the blockchain is that it becomes a secure ledger of which you can store information, you can store transactions on. And underneath it all, obviously there's networking, because none of this can exist without a way to transmit this data back and forth. But underlying all of this is the cloud. Cloud computing makes AI possible. It makes it possible for you to call Uber or Uber Eats. It makes it possible for you to back up your data seamlessly. So if and when your computer crashes, you can restore it immediately. Your cell phone, your smartphone, as we used to call it. I don't know if we're still calling them smartphones because pretty much everyone has one. But if you drop that phone in water and it ceases to work, your data is not lost. It's backed up in the cloud. So when you get another phone, it gets restored immediately. Not just the data, but the applications that are on your phone, your contacts, all of that. It's all seamless now. That's all because of the cloud. And now we're moving forward to robotics, which will use AI and machine learning. Everyone's talking about this Tesla robot now. So, in summary, I just wanted to get on here and just represent for the Generation Xers, because although they want to lump us into the same generation as the boomers, the baby boomers, that is, much respect, we are not the baby boomers. We are our own distinct generation, and we got to be proud of that, because now we're like the middle child. They forget about the middle child, but we're the ones that connect the two generations together that are still in the workplace. Or, now it's 4 generations in the workplace, including the Gen Zs. But the baby boomers, my mother's still working by choice because she loves what she does and she's still able to work. But my mother's a baby boomer. I'm a Generation Xer. The generation after me are millennials. And the generation after them are Gen Zers. So there's 4 generations in the workplace. And as a Generation Xer, yes, we did grow up with technology, believe it or not. Yes, we grew up with color TV. Yeah, I did have a black and white TV when I was a kid too, but that's because they were cheaper. And when I was like 10 years old, my mother was like, "You don't need no color TV, boy. You're lucky to have a TV, period." So yeah, I did have a black and white TV, but we grew up with color TVs. I grew up playing video games. They weren't the video game that you know today with all the high-end graphics, but the Atari 2600, it was revolutionary for its time with the joystick, playing Asteroids and Space Invaders, Pitfall, Donkey Kong, eventually Pac-Man. So we saw the technology take off. And we are here to bridge that gap because we know what it's like before and after. The 21st century is completely different than the 20th century. It should be, because these are different centuries, but I don't know if it's by design or if it's just by chance. But for those of you who are of my generation, just think about how life, and I'm just going to use 9/11 as the delineation point. 9/11, 2001 was the time, the delineation point where everything changed. The Department of Homeland Security did not exist before that. It was created, which is the largest government agency, from my understanding, in the federal government. It was created as a result of 9/11. Prior to 9/11, you can just get on a plane with minimum security. You can actually walk up to the gate with your loved one, give them a hug and a kiss, and see them walk through the gates onto the plane. You can't do that now. You got to go through TSA. These are just little things, but they are big things. So life is completely different in the 21st century than it was in the 20th century. And I witnessed the whole transition. I've seen it. I remember when the internet became a big thing after 1994. And I was like, what? I no longer have to go to the library, even though you should still go to the library. But back then I was like, what? I can just access this information, because I was still in college at the time. And I was like, oh, I don't have to go to the library to do research. I can just log on to the internet and get that information online. And during that time when the internet was new and people was like, what's the internet? The majority of people thought that the internet was evil. It might be. But just like any form of media or any medium could be evil because it's just a conduit for information. It depends on the quality of that information that's going through that conduit. But yes, it opens up the floodgates for more information to come through. And that in itself is not evil, but it does open up possibilities of bad things happening. It's like the gift of fire, technology that is. It's like the gift of fire. Fire can be used to keep you warm, to enlighten a room, so that you can see, to cook your food, to purify things, but it can also be used to burn down your house. Does that mean fire is evil? So these are the things that myself as a philosopher, I ponder on. So that's all I wanted to say today. I know that was a long rant, but Gen Xers, keep your head up. We still here. We strong. Stay focused. Stay curious, because the moment you stop being curious, that's when you start becoming irrelevant. So stay curious. Stay motivated. Stay inspired, and be willing to inspire others. And above all, stay lucid. Peace out.